Welcome to EER's 12th webinar. The subject today is the global fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've previously covered issues of radicalization and the destabilization in the immediate region in Europe. Today we thought we'd have a look at some of the consequences further afield, whether it's the economic impacts in the Gulf, geopolitics involving states like China, and in general the changed world after February 24. To discuss that, we've brought in an expert panel. Among them is David Des Roches, Dr. David Des Roches, I should say, Professor of Practice at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He's a former Army officer and a career civil servant in the Defense Department, where he worked on the Arab Gulf, Pakistan, and other states. We have with us Dr. Andrey Kortunov. He's a Russian political scientist and the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, which focuses on promoting global integration and on preventing and resolving conflicts, which is quite relevant at the moment. We have Dr. Saeed Sadiki, who's a professor of political science and international relations at Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah University of Morocco. We go to you, Dr. David Des Roches, for the first round.
Well, thank you. You have to enable my screen sharing. Be here. I'm really honored and pleased to be here with such distinguished panelists. I always have to say that my comments do not reflect the view of the U.S. government, and I am a professor, but not a doctor. So one means I'm educated, the other means I'm employed, and I'm happy to be employed. I'm going to talk about three developments that the Ukraine war has on conflict in the Middle East and the broader political solution. So starting off, the first, the Russian army, the Russian armed forces is not what we thought it was. I think that there are very, very few analysts. There are many analysts who are claiming that they knew this, but very few actually did in real time. I certainly was not one of them. So of course, we've seen the famous convoy backed up, the defeat before Kiev and its movement backwards, the lack of the inability of the Russian Air Force to get air control over Ukraine and even over the local battlefield, the ineffectiveness of Russian electronic warfare, and really the inaccuracy and lack of combat effect of the Russian long-range missile and artillery batteries. All of these are things that I thought were going to be much more effective than they were. And I thought that this war would be a Russian victory within about 2 weeks. So one of the areas that we saw that was particularly surprising is the ineffectiveness of Russian missiles, and in particular cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles. One source has estimated as much of a 60% failure rate. I think that's a little bit high, but I think we are looking at it. I think a failure rate of 40% is not outrageous to claim for these weapons. And I think that even though there's been reports of things like hypersonic weapons being fired, hypersonic missiles, I don't think that they've been used in the hypersonic flight pattern. So I think what we're seeing is Russia is using these weapons, but they're using them in the sort of the simpler dumbed down mode. At the same time, while we've seen a lot of cruise missile, caliber missiles, missiles launched from submarines, from aircraft, from Iskander launchers, the lack of accurate targeting has meant that a lot of these are fired at civilian infrastructures rather than high-value military targets, which I think really minimizes the effect of these weapons. And again, I didn't think we'd see that. We're also seeing a lot of failures of weapon systems due to what seem to be broader systemic issues in the Russian armed forces. And we've got a lag on the slides here, but this shows one that really surprised me. So these are two Panzer air defense systems, which were captured by the Ukrainian forces. After the attack on the Abkhaz refinery in 2019, a lot of countries looked at Panzer as sort of the state-of-the-art, world-class short-range defense weapon system. And it was attractive for a number of reasons. First off, as you can see, it has an integrated radar. It has missiles and it has guns, whereas with Western short-range systems, usually those are separate systems. And so a lot of countries bought this, to include the United Arab Emirates. And what we saw is that the picture on the top has become kind of famous in military circles. You can see the oil bleeding out from the wheels on the tire. Basically, what we saw was a $25 million air defense system that wasn't maintained. This oil bleed out seems to indicate that basically the tires weren't properly inflated. The system wasn't fired up and moved, so that you had rot within the seals of it. And this level of maintenance is you can find stories like this across the entire Russian armed forces. What it indicates is the problems you have from a poorly trained, poorly motivated soldiery. And what this calls into question is stuff with strategic impact, and it has strategic impact not just in terms of potential confrontation between Russia and China or Russia and NATO, but also for countries that were looking at Russia as a possible solution for systems such as air defense. And basically, what we see here is that all of the air defense systems to the left of the strategic blue dotted line on this chart have not performed to expectations. So things that we thought were viable weapon systems that were integrated, and at least on paper and from an engineering standpoint, the Russian approach to layered integrated air defense was extremely attractive, but we're seeing that in practice it's not as good. At the same time, we're seeing Russian vulnerability to weapon systems that are now within the hands of second-tier powers like Ukraine and even third-tier powers, in particular attacks on armed drones. Of course, these are all over the internet. We had expected the Russian armed forces, with their historical emphasis on electronic warfare and air defense, to be much better prepared to deal with this threat. Particularly given that we had a kind of a wake-up call last year with the defeat of the Russian model Armenian forces that were supported by Azerbaijan, using a relatively improvised drone force. So that really came as a surprise. Now, one famous analyst of the Russian military has said, I've spent the last 12 years telling everybody that the Russians are not 10 feet tall, and I'm going to spend the next 20 years telling everybody they're not 4 feet tall either. So it's possible to make too much of these deficiencies, but the fact remains that the poor performance of the Russian armed forces was a real surprise. The second issue is the prevalence and the sort of resurgence for the idea of this American concept that we can actually support like-minded countries. Notice I didn't say allies, at a distance. In the wake of the disastrous, chaotic, humiliating American withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was a narrative making the round in allied capitals and in security partners of the United States. The United States was done, that it was an unreliable partner, that it was unable and or unwilling to provide capability to countries, outside of the Western Hemisphere, really, or outside of NATO. But what we've seen is a surprisingly robust reaction. Now, there hasn't been direct involvement, there hasn't been the declaration of a no-fly zone, but we've seen heavy weaponry like these M777 155 millimeter howitzers, which are important parts of the U.S. military arsenal, and they are being stripped from active duty Army and Marine Corps units and have been in very short order transported and put on the firing line in Ukraine. So up top, you see them being prepared for shipment. I think that's the airport at Lawton, Oklahoma. And then at the bottom, there they are in combat with Ukrainian forces. The effectiveness of global sanctions in support of the Ukrainian government has surprised me. There are still some outliers like China, possibly India, but by and large, it's been extremely effective, and it's been across the board. The one exception is what everybody knew would be the problem, which is natural gas shipments to European economies that are dependent on them. But again, what we see here is that even without a formal treaty alliance, even without a formal American and Western commitment of support, even without a robust position on the ground, the United States and its partners have been able to effectively support Ukraine in its position. In large part, a lot of this reflects something that went under the radar, which is a sustained Western and Americans supported the Ukrainian forces, which kicked up after the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, and was relatively low-key and focused on developing key leaders. And one of the key military aspects, which I think will resonate in the Middle East, where, quite frankly, most Arab armies are closer to the Russian army than they are to a Western army in terms of having top-down command and a lack of trained, skilled junior soldiers who can seize the initiative. Ukraine seems to have gotten on the right side of this. So here you see Illinois National Guardsmen facilitating and teaching Ukrainian soldiers, and what they're teaching them is English language. And this was a sustained effort over the last 8 years. And then what follows from it are the soft skills, not how to fire an anti-tank missile, but things like how to give mission-based orders. That's stuff that partners in the Middle East often neglect, but it's proven to be very, very vital on the battlefield. And so I hope that our Arab partners will pick up on that. The third development, this is one that concerns me, is the fact that there is going to be a global food crisis, and I think it has great potential to destabilize the Middle East. There are three causes of this global food crisis. Two of them I put solely at the feet of Russians. The third is a shared, I also put it at the feet of the Russians, but you could argue it's a Western. So look, if there's a war between Italy and France, regardless of how that war goes, the market for wine is going to spike just because markets anticipate the future. And so what we have here is a war between two of the major wheat exporters in the world. You can see this is the 2020 tonnage. So all of that Ukrainian wheat we can expect to be off the market, and much of that Russian wheat is off the market. And so we can expect those wheat prices to rise. The Ukrainian wheat is off because devastation of farmland, inability to farm, blockade of the port. I lay that at Russia's feet. The uncertainty in the market, I also lay at Russia's feet. But the third factor is the imposition of sanctions on Russia, which forces Russia into payment systems that Russia refuses to accept. And so Russia is holding back that. So that's kind of on this. When we look at wheat prices, we can see that they were already on the rise before the invasion of Ukraine. And in part, this is due to a record poor weather in places like China, India, and the United States. But the invasion has led these prices to spike. And when we look at countries that are extremely dependent on wheat imports, and I'm thinking here mostly of Egypt, but we also have other countries such as Yemen, Jordan, Lebanon, and most of the sub-Saharan African countries, we have the potential here for price spikes, which won't affect people in relatively rich countries, but could lead to, if not starvation, at least conditions of food scarcity and undermining, given that, the Egyptian economy is never good, even in the best of times, with increased wheat sales or wheat shortages, it's going to be a big problem. The last time we saw a spike like this was in the wake of the financial crisis. And this chart shows a standardized food price index, so it reflects more than just wheat. But if you look at the spike in 2011, and then look at the countries there, this preceded and arguably helped set off the so-called Arab Spring protests. And when you look at these countries that were really on the wrong side of these spikes that were food importers, a lot of them had political instability. All of them had political instability, and three of them, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, are to this day and have ongoing military conflicts. And so the security impacts of the knock-on impact of the disruption to the global food market because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think, separate from the military lessons, has great potential. And I'd say it's more likely than not to cause political instability in the Middle East region, which then will probably translate itself into war. And so with that, I welcome your questions, and it's an honor to be here.
Thanks for getting us off to a great start. If we go over to Andrey for the next round.
So let me start with saying that, of course, there are many independent variables at play here, and I'd like to make two caveats. First of all, the conflict is not over, and we don't even know how it will end, how much time it will take, and what the outcomes are likely to be. There are many scholars which are playing with scenarios, and there is a broad range of such scenarios on the table. So definitely a lot will depend on how long the conflict will last and what kind of outcomes we will see. And my second caveat is, of course, the conflict is linked to many other problems that we observe right now in the international system. The world has not fully recovered from the global pandemic, and it might slide into another recession. The world is undergoing a very painful and complicated energy transition, and there are many other factors that might have an impact on the current situation. But in order to not to repeat what David has just said, let me just limit myself to a couple of relatively specific repercussions of this conflict on political extremism and radicalism in the MENA region. First of all, it is clear that any conflict generates a flow of loose guns that might be apprehended by radicals and terrorists. The conflict in and around Ukraine is not an exception, but it has some specific characteristics. One of them is that the Ukrainian leadership made a strategic decision to hand small arms into the hands of civil population, which blurs the usual dividing line between combatants and non-combatants, and definitely it leads to proliferation of small arms. But another specific feature of the conflict is the level of military support that was rendered to Ukraine by the United States and a number of its allies. And this support includes certain relatively sophisticated and advanced systems, including anti-aircraft systems like javelins, anti-tank systems like javelins and anti-aircraft systems as well. And I think that it is easy to predict that these systems, part of these systems might migrate to the MENA region and might get into hands of radical political groups. So we should keep an eye on the weapons, since these weapons are likely to get proliferated. My second point is on the specific implications of the conflict on the situation in the MENA region itself. I think the most important change that we can now observe is a rather rapid deterioration of relations between Russia and Israel. Israel has tried to stay neutral in the conflict, but I think the logic of the conflict drove Israel closer to Ukraine, which is clearly detrimental to previously very close cooperation between Moscow and Jerusalem. And I think that the net result of this change is that Iranians are getting stronger positions in Syria. Russia will be forced to cooperate with Iran more than it did before the conflict. And that might disrupt this very delicate balance of powers which exists in Syria. So I'm not very optimistic about the developments in Syria. I also believe that one of the implications of the conflict is that Turkey is becoming more assertive in Iraq and in Syria. We've seen that Turkey has started its own special military operation in northern Iran, and it might try to change the balance of powers in the north of Syria in its favor. It might try to get more assertive in Idlib. And I think that that would also mean serious implications, not only for Syria, but for the MENA region at large. I believe that the conflict will have certain negative implications on Afghanistan, and mostly in the sense that Afghanistan is likely to be neglected. And by the way, I forgot to mention on Syria is that the UN Security Council resolution that was extended last year on humanitarian corridors in Idlib is not likely to be extended this year. And it expires already in July. And if it is not extended, we might see a deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Idlib, maybe in Syria at large. And that would definitely feed political radicalism and instability in this country and around this country. Now, speaking of Afghanistan, I'd like just to mention that the odds are that Afghanistan might be neglected. It might be put on a back burner. And it's not clear whether Taliban is ready to maintain the current level of public support, and whether Taliban is not gradually replaced, or at least whether Afghanistan does not have to share power with some of even more radical Islamist groups, specifically ISIS-K, which, unlike Taliban, have a very clear internationalist agenda. I think we should consider this challenge as something which might manifest itself already this year or maybe next year. It is still not clear whether Taliban is in a position to control power not only in Kabul, but in the countryside, especially in northern and eastern parts of the country. I would also like to add that one of the potential dangers of the conflict in Ukraine is that this conflict might become a training pad for mercenaries, volunteers, for private military companies, and for other groups that might later on focus on other regions and other parts of the world. We already observe gradual internationalization of the conflict on both sides, and the longer the conflict lasts for, the higher the chances are that this internationalization will go on. So I fully agree with what David mentioned about food security. I would add that food security will be also affected by the volatility of energy prices, because food is very energy consuming sector of the economy. And on top of that, we have a clear disruption of the fertilizers markets. Because more than 20% of fertilizers are exported by only two countries, Russia and Belarus. And if these deliveries are disrupted, it might have a significant impact on a large number of countries, mostly in Africa, but also in the Middle East and even in Latin America. So I think that unfortunately the implications are likely to be quite significant. The implications are likely to be primarily negative. So my overall conclusion is that in the interest of the international community is to stop this war as fast as possible, even if that implies an imperfect compromise between the fighting sides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Said.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important webinar. I will try in my presentation to foresee how countries of the Middle East and North Africa prospect their position in the international system after the Ukraine crisis. I think for the MENA countries in general, this crisis represents both a challenge and an opportunity at the same time. There have been significant economic challenges, especially in food and energy security, especially of non-oil and gas producing countries, as Andrey and David mentioned, at least in the short term. But it is a great opportunity for oil and gas producing countries to benefit from the financial gain from the increase in their exports revenue. But it is also an important political opportunity for all MENA countries to reposition themselves in the international and regional systems, especially in their relations with major powers. In this regard, I would like to stress that the position of the MENA countries in the current international system and regional subsystems determines their view and prospects for their future position in the post-Ukrainian crisis world. One of the major concerns of decision makers in the MENA region is how to reconcile between maintaining traditional alliances and seeking to diversify their strategic partners. After the Arab Spring uprising, many MENA countries began to diversify their strategic partners, especially when they found themselves without American support, and this concern was further reinforced by some unusual positions of the American administrations towards some crises in the Arab region, especially in Yemen, Libya, and Syria, as well as the Western Sahara issue. The United States withdrawal of its Patriots anti-missile defense batteries from Saudi Arabia in a critical period of Saudi national security was a negative message to the United States allies in the MENA region. Additionally, the current multipolar system has provided the MENA countries a wide margin of maneuver and more alternatives. This explains to some extent why the MENA countries joined the Belt and Road Initiative and signed various agreements with China. Also, in recent years, for the first time, the heads of Russia and some Arab countries paid official visits to each other, including Saudi Arabia in 2017, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Egypt, and so on, and they signed strategic agreements and treaties in different areas. There is an important question that can be posed because of the positions of many of the MENA countries on the Ukraine crisis, which don't fully agree with their Western allies. The question is there a trend for a new non-alignment? I mean, do positions of the MENA countries on Russia's invasion of Ukraine mean that the trend to adopt non-aligned policies on such complex issue, or are they just looking for win-win partnerships and also for more solid Western guarantees regarding their strategic and vital interests, especially with regard of their national security? I think the appropriate answer to this question is that in a multipolar system, the MENA countries in general are trying to be realistic and pragmatic in their positions, and sometimes they adopt a calculated neutrality, especially for their immediate interest. So I think the positions of the MENA countries toward the Ukrainian crisis don't indicate a new policy of non-alignment, but rather are pragmatic, rational, and well-calculated positions by which they have tried to balance their immediate interests, not strategic ones between Russia and the West. I think the Ukraine crisis is an important opportunity to reconsider the foundations of the old relations between MENA and Western countries and rethink and renegotiate new foundations for strategic partnership between them. There is another important question whose answer requires drawing a specific picture of the future of the region. This question is the United States still a key stabilizer in the MENA region? Despite misunderstandings that have increased in recent years between the US and its allies in the MENA region, the United States remains a major player and has decisive role and influence in the current dynamics in the region. On the other hand, the Ukraine crisis proved beyond any doubt that Europe is currently unable to guarantee its security and still need the US security umbrella, which means that European Union can't provide strong and sufficient guarantees for the security and stability of the MENA region. In addition, if the objectives of the American strategy are largely achieved in Ukraine, the US role in the world will be strengthened, and its protection not only for the security of its allies in the MENA region, but also those of European Union countries will be further reinforced. Therefore, I don't think that the MENA countries want a large and wide defeat for Russia in Ukraine, and also they don't want a complete exclusion or at least isolation of Russia from the international system, because this will reduce their margin of maneuver under a rigid bipolar system led only by the United States and China. And I think this is the concern of many European countries too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was going to go forward with the first question. So if I would go to David first, ask, is there anything the US can do to mitigate the economic fallout of all this, particularly the grain and the wheat prices?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot it can do and there's a lot it will do. I mean, the US is, the issue is, though, it'll be more on a humanitarian basis, not manipulating the markets. So the United States has established programs where it exports food to countries that are in severe crisis, and we're usually the largest donor to that globally. But the problem is, with food, you have to have 6 months lead time. You can't just build this stuff. And as I've said earlier, there's problems in other countries. China's having a bad year, India's having a bad year, and the United States is having a bad year. So there's still going to be a problem. And then finally, this is aid provided to people who are starving, not aid to subsidize markets. So the prices again are going to spike. So I think the mitigation efforts are around the margin. It's not something that the United States can solve unilaterally.
That's quite depressing. I was going to ask Andrey about the Russian position in Syria. We keep getting reports, which I think have been basically falsified so far, that the Russians are pulling out troops to put into Ukraine. I basically want to ask, do you think at some point that may become credible, that the Russian need for manpower will involve pulling in from the semi-colonial ventures in Africa and even in the Western Hemisphere, and Russia will kind of have to pull in its security chips from around the world to carry on with the war?
Well, the Russian operation in Syria is a relatively low-scale, low-budget operation. It involves primarily air support for the ground operations, which are conducted by Bashar Assad and the Shia militia supported by Iranians. So it's not a question of physical shortage of manpower. I think that there might be a stretch in terms of the Air Force if indeed Russia has to concentrate on Ukraine. However, if you look at the numbers of sorties in Syria recently, you'll see that there is no real escalation, and probably Russia can downscale without taking too high risks in terms of its military presence in Syria. So I think militarily, the operation is probably sustainable, at least for a midterm future. I think that the challenge might be different. It might be the challenge of the economic relations between Russia and Syria, because Bashar Assad apparently wants Russia to render more economic assistance in view of the mounting US sanctions after the Caesar law. And I don't know to what extent Russia can render this assistance to the Syrian regime. What we see happening in Syria today is that Damascus is trying hard to reach out to Gulf states to get back to the League of Arab States and to receive some investments and also some financial and economic assistance coming from the West, including assistance from rather large Syrian diasporas in Gulf countries. So I think that this is the challenge, and we'll see how it turns out. But speaking of other Russian engagements, you should keep in mind that most of these engagements are associated with private military companies, be it in places like Libya or in Mali or in some other African nations. Again, you know, these are low budget engagements, and I don't think that at this particular juncture these investments are in jeopardy. But of course, the longer the war lasts, the more needs there are for Russia to focus on Ukraine specifically.
Thank you very much. Saeed, I wanted to ask you about basically Morocco's position with Algeria. It's a kind of specific question, but one of the states that is kind of contested, especially as the oil markets get volatile, is Algeria, and the Russians seem to be trying to at least regain some foothold there. Do you think it's likely that Morocco and Algeria's relations will deteriorate in any serious way in the coming phase, possibly as a result of the outside machinations over the Ukraine war?
Thank you for this important question. As we know, before the Ukraine crisis, the relations between Morocco and Algeria was in its worst situation. So this crisis, I think, will not affect more this relation, which is related not in the nature of the international system. Maybe such international crises affect to some extent the relations and the situation in general in the Maghreb region, but I think the problem is rooted in the nature of the regional subsystem, not the international one. The problem between Morocco and Algeria dates back to the beginning of their independence, because of the why the national borders, how the national borders were created, were delineated, and also how the nation states in the North Africa, especially in Maghreb, were established. There is a huge mutual mistrust and suspicion between Morocco and Algeria, which I say is related or are related to the nature of the international of the regional subsystem. So what we see now is not especially with regard to the Western Sahara issue, It is not the cause of these bad relations between the two neighboring countries, but it is the result, it is the aspect of the nature of the existing regional subsystem. So I think maybe this crisis will affect to some extent the relations between, negatively the relations between two states, but the relations was worse before the outbreak of the Ukraine crisis. Morocco has more alternatives because before the Ukraine crisis, Algeria stopped working this pipeline between Algeria to Spain through Morocco. So Morocco, I think, tried to sign other agreements with oil and gas producing countries, and also in recent weeks there is an important phase in the relations between Morocco and Spain, which I think supplying Morocco with gas is one of the main new phase of the relation between Morocco and Spain. So I think my idea is that the relations between Morocco and Algeria is not related to the international context and is not affected more by international context, but by the regional context.
That makes sense. To return to David, a slightly abstract question, but we mentioned that in a sense the Russian army is not what many people thought it was. And I think even people who thought the Russian army was more hollow than it seemed on paper didn't expect this scale of disaster from it. Basically, I was wondering what you think the lessons NATO are going to take from this are. I mean, will it involve different troop deployments? Will it involve differentials about which weapons we invest in? How do you think it will change things going forward?
Yeah, good question. I think there are some issues that are like institutional that NATO can't really affect. The fact that you have untrained soldiers, the level of training in individual soldier operations in the Russian army, poor maintenance of vehicles. Those are things that NATO would probably want to accelerate, but can't really affect one way or the other. I think the big lesson I learned was the ineffectiveness of Russian army sustainment operations when it's more than 40 miles from a railhead. The reason, if you look at the map of where the Russian army succeeded and failed, you can almost extrapolate 100% distance from a fixed base and a railhead. And so I think the NATO implication of that is what you have to do is develop long-range precision strike to disrupt the Russian rail network in the event of any conflict. That forces their logistics onto the road, and what we've seen there, that's where the poor maintenance, lack of initiative comes into play. So basically, deep strike for NATO, and then secondary would be probably some sort of behind the lines operations, whether with drones, special forces, or again, precision strike artillery to do that. I think the second thing that we'll see, and this is not just as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine, but comes also on the Armenia-Azerbaijan, is the development of relatively small drones like commercial hovercraft drones down to the platoon level to be used for indirect fire support, integrated into the fire support network. Then the third thing we've seen is the Ukrainian fire support control is much more like the Uber app than it is like the US Army fire support control. Basically, the Ukrainians have developed software that says, here's the target, who's got a gun? Okay, the closest gun, you fire at this target. The US model, which most NATO countries have, sends everything to a centralized command and control headquarters. and then slows it down because like the judge advocate general looks at it, they've basically poisoned the fire control network. And so it's slow. At some point, we're going to have to say, okay, that system is fine for a limited war where your primary consideration is the avoidance of civilian casualties like in Afghanistan. But in a general war, like World War II or like a war between NATO and Russia would be, you've got to fire quickly. And I think there's going to be a real talk about adapting a decentralized fire support network for that.
Thank you. Andrey, I want to ask quite a broad question really, but how do you see Russia's relations with China evolving going forward after this? I know there are some who think that in a sense it will be a position of subservience, something that will be more a partnership, something that Russia will, after a period of, how should we say, a period on the northeast steppe, will kind of try and rebalance relations between West and East. How do you see that going?
Well, first of all, I think that Russia's relations to China depend on Beijing more than on Moscow. And a big question is how far Beijing is likely to go in its support of Moscow, because apparently China has good relations not only with Russia, but also with Ukraine. And definitely it does not want to burn bridges to Kyiv. At the same time, the more NATO involvement we observe, the more supportive China turns out to be, because for many politicians in Beijing, it's not about Russia and Ukraine, but it's about Russia and the West. And I think that is a game changer for the Chinese side. Another independent variable is about the lessons. And I had a chance to talk to a number of Chinese peers, and I can see that there is no consensus in China about what lessons China should draw from this conflict. Because on the one hand, they argue that the West has demonstrated the level of unity that was unpredictable and that was unprecedented, and that is something that should deter China from going after Taiwan. But on the other hand, there is a group of experts in China who make the opposite conclusions. They say that, look, of course NATO supports Ukraine, but NATO cannot really defend Ukraine. It cannot protect Ukraine. It cannot save Ukraine from losing this war, which means that NATO or the United States or AUKUS or whatever combination of Western powers cannot really inflict unacceptable damage on China if China decides to take Taiwan by military means. So it is not yet clear what ultimate conclusions the Chinese will make on the basis of this conflict. But I think that Russia, in a way, is a product of the China-US relations. If these relations go sour, if there is more confrontation between Beijing and Washington, China will be readier for a close alliance with Moscow. I think that the asymmetry in this relationship will increase, but China, at least the current Chinese leadership, will do whatever is needed to make sure that this relationship, at least formally, appears as a relationship of equal strategic partners. I think it is in their interests, and they will say all the right words. They will make all the right statements about this partnership between two major powers.
Thanks so much. Saeed, in a similar way, you were mentioning about a lot of states in the MENA kind of diversifying their security situation because the US seemed so unreliable. The obvious one is Israel, is the Abraham Accords that have brought the Israelis into more formal security relationships with some of the Arab states. Do you think that will be enough to do this, to kind of counterbalance the problems, or do you see these states having to look further afield, maybe to China, for security?
I think even if many countries in North Africa and the Gulf are looking for diversifying their partners, especially with regard to their economic and military interest. But I think some initiative like Abraham is more on the paper than on the reality. I don't expect that this plan will have important effect in the reality. Because the issue of Palestinian issue, relations with Arab and Israel are more complicated that this initiative try to set up. So most North African and Gulf especially are pro-Western countries, which means their security in future will be relied more on the American umbrella. Regardless, some misunderstandings. So also the Ukraine crisis will reinforce this vision. I think the Ukraine crisis, even if now some, especially some Gulf countries, try to take some neutral positions to balance the relations between United States and Russia. But I think strategically, they will be relying more on the Western umbrella, especially the United States. Yeah, Russia will try to reinforce its influence in the region, but the American strategy in the region, I think, will make many troubles and will disrupt such strategy to threat the American interest and especially its relations with traditional US traditional allies in the Arab country. I think if I want to summarize my idea, regardless what happened now, what is happening now, especially some positions of Arab countries that are known as Western, pro-Western countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the United States will be always, at least on the midterm period, a key stabilizer and key guarantee of national security of majority of Arab countries, especially in North Africa, except of course Algeria and in the Gulf.
Thank you so much. I want to just give everybody basically 30 seconds to a minute to kind of draw together and sum up. So if we go to David for the last round.
Yeah. So this war is a profound development in military technology and military techniques. And what we've seen historically is that Arab states adapt the military techniques related to equipment. They're less likely to adapt the techniques related to personnel. And so I just want to point out that approach is usually the wrong approach. Russia has the advantage across the board in equipment. What it really shows is the importance of an army investing in its human capital and investing in bottom-up leadership and mission-directed orders. That requires training, and that's going to be very, very hard. So, you know, we could be at a revolution in military affairs, but it's got to take a lot of hard work that historically has been difficult for Middle East countries.
Thank you very much. Andrey, to you for the last.
Well, my take is that though the crisis between Russia and Ukraine distracted the global attention from the MENA region, but if you look at the midterm and the long-term future, I think the MENA region will continue to be the main source of instability, and the main terrain for various conflicts and a producer of instability and international terrorism. So I think that whatever happens between Russia and Ukraine, we should keep a close eye on the MENA region, because this is where a lot of action will take place in the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. And Saeed, the last.
My key argument is that the Ukraine crisis actually, even if it represents a challenge to the current international system and also the regional system and subsystems in the region, but will not lead to a fundamental change in the nature of the existing regional and international system, because especially international system is characterized by a high degree of resilience to absorb major international shocks, as happened when the Cold War ended after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's why I don't expect a big change in the balance of power in the region. So I think the international system and international regional subsystem will absorb the implications of the Cold War. There will be some changes, but not fundamental change. So the relations between the MENA region and international powers will be the same. There will be some changes, but relative change, not a fundamental transformation of these relations.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for being here. It was a great webinar with us. We hope to see you again soon.